The name Hannibal Lecter has become synonymous with the Academy Award-winning performance by Anthony Hopkins in the film The Silence of the Lambs, along with its sequel Hannibal and prequel Red Dragon. Until recent years, Hopkins' interpretation was the only version of the character and his world acknowledged by fans of the films or novels. They eventually warmed up to the recent television series Hannibal, but before all of this, there was a film that had been entirely forgotten by the general public. The film was Manhunter, directed by Michael Mann and distributed by the now-defunct De Laurentiis Entertainment Group. Manhunter was based on the 1981 novel Red Dragon by Thomas Harris and was the first adaptation of the thriller mystery novel, which would eventually be readapted 2 more times with the 2002 remake named after the novel, and again in 2015 for the 3rd season of the television series Hannibal. Upon its release, Manhunter was by all accounts a flop for both critics and audiences at the time, making a paltry $8.6 million over its entire theatrical run on a $15 million budget, and received a mixed critical reception. Many took issue with the film's emphasis on music and style, saying it made the film feel hokey. William Peterson, who plays the lead character of Will Graham in the film, was also criticized for his performance, with many believing he didn't have the chops to be the lead in a film. This all but doomed the film at the time to be lost in obscurity and to be considered that failed attempt to do a Hannibal Lecter film before The Silence of the Lambs. This analysis will mainly focus on how Manhunter is an adequate adaptation of the novel Red Dragon. First, one must understand what adaptation theory is, as well as how it will all be used to form the argument that the film is a good adaptation based on those ideals. From the Canadian academic Linda Hutchian's A Theory of Adaptation, adaptation is repetition without replication, meaning the work will be repetitious as an adaptation of an original material, but won't fall into being a complete replication due to changes made by jumping from one format to another. Hutchian says, with adaptation, there are manifestly many different possible intentions behind the act of adaptation. The urge to consume and erase the memory of the adapted text or to call it into question is as likely as the desire to pay tribute by copying. Adaptation is best described as being its own palimpsestuous product, to create a new form from the original but all while maintaining elements of that original work. It must acknowledge the transposition of recognizable works, be creative and interpretive with what it takes from said works, all while maintaining an intertextual engagement with the adapted work. For example, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films fulfill their requirements as the films serve as adequate adaptations of J.R.R. Tolkien's original novels, while still making the necessary changes from those novels to tell a better fitting story for a theatrical runtime. Tom Bombadil had to take his music to another part of Middle-earth. One may even argue that the recent Ghost in the Shell film from 2017 is a good adaptation on the amount of elements both visually and thematically carried over, though the casting of Scarlett Johansson is a can of worms all its own for another analysis. Conversely, something along the lines of the Super Mario Bros. Movie from 1993, which isn't a good adaptation as it retains nothing from its original source, applying names and labels to things that don't resemble that original product. There's also 1986's Howard the Duck, based on a comic about a crime detective duck in the Marvel Universe, who in the film comes to our reality, befriends a struggling singer, and commences what can only be described as duck-on-human romance. To get to the point, adaptation comes in many forms, and more often than not, in decades prior, failed to properly represent their original material. Manhunter's creation and release is an interesting history. Before Michael Mann stepped up to direct, David Lynch was offered the film after working on Dune, but he rejected it for being violent and completely degenerate. Ironic given some of the characters and films Lynch would go on to make.
Baby wants to fuck.
One noticeable change is that of all things, the title of the adaptation was changed from Red Dragon to Manhunter, for fear that the original title too closely resembled Dino De Laurentiis' previous produced film, Year of the Dragon, which had bombed in 1985. Another reason was the title was felt to be too close sounding to a kung fu movie, so it was changed to Manhunter, a name both Michael Mann and Hannibal actor Brian Cox have disdain for. As an adaptation, Manhunter stays relatively faithful to the original novel by Thomas Harris. Both share the same basic plot. Will Graham is a retired special investigator for the FBI who gets dragged back into the fold by his boss and at one point friend, Jack Crawford, to help him track down the perpetrator of what is coined the Tooth Fairy murders, which saw the brutal slayings of 2 families as they slept before the killer can strike again during the next full moon. Both have Will visit a serial killer he had previously captured known as Hannibal the Cannibal Lecter, who serves as a mirror of what the mentally unstable Will could become if he lets himself go over the edge. Francis Dollarhide is the villain of both the original work and adaptation, though both use his character at different points in the story, as well as different approaches to his mental state. Hannibal is always kept in confinement in both versions and helps Will get back to the mentality he needs to track down the Tooth Fairy killer, though like the novel, he's able to communicate with Will outside of his confinement thanks to his cleverness and ability to find where anyone is when he wants to. Will's wife Molly and son Kevin, renamed from the original novel's name of Willie, are supporting characters who go through the biggest change. Though this is more background information that has changed, it does affect the relationship they have with Will. As shown, a majority of the characters remain how they are in the original story with slight variations, and it for the most part keeps up being a faithful adaptation. This is until the third act, where dramatic shifts in where the film ends and how its characters end up are a prime example of the adapter deciding to change what originally worked and taking their own swing at the storyline. Will Graham from the novel to film is left relatively intact and is an accurate representation of what readers must have pictured in their head. William Peterson worked with both the Chicago Police Department and FBI's violent crimes units to get himself in the mental state for the role. He plays Will Graham as a broken man who is trying to rebuild his family life after retiring from a job that nearly ruined him psychologically. Thanks to his performance and the way Will is written, we understand that he's a man who is a breath away from becoming the very monsters he's chasing, highlighted by his interaction with an imprisoned Hannibal. Speaking on his take on the character, Peterson recalls, "Of course, you don't really turn it off. At the end of the day, even if you're just a regular policeman, it takes a toll." Interestingly though, the story of Will near the end of the film becomes greatly changed due to the limitations the film faced after virtually running completely out of funds. In the film, Will and Jack along with a handful of police go to take down Frances, who has kidnapped Reba, a blind woman he works with, and brought her to his home. During this face-off, Will is able to kill Frances. It's noted in behind-the-scenes material that because the film had no budget, many of the crew left the film and director Michael Mann did the blood effects himself, and in some instances, shoots ketchup from a straw. During this face-off, Will is able to kill Frances and save Reba, and the film ends with Will saying he's all better and reuniting with his family in front of a sunrise on the beach. While thematically this ending feels fine from a Hollywood thriller perspective, it cuts out a major plot point from the novel, as Frances is supposed to have escaped after it's believed he committed suicide. Afterwards, when Will returns home to his family, Dollarhide is to have attacked them, and then Will's wife kills Frances at the home after he disfigures Will. The story then leaves off on Will recovering as he thinks back to another crime he stopped and coming to a realization about himself and the world. So while Will is for the most part represented as he is, limitations and creative changes left the character on a different mental and physical plane than he was from the original novel as he slips into the darkness. Around Will as well as his family, who go through slight changes that actually have a larger impact on Will as a character for the reader. In the original novel, his wife Molly and her son Willie come into Will's life after he's gone through his traumatic experiences with the FBI. This causes a distance between Will's family life as they never get to see the man he was as an investigator and watch as he reverts to that man. Then, the added effect of Willie not being Will's own blood, but instead a stepson, plays into his distancing himself from them. In the film, of course, this is changed to be the typical family dynamic who are well aware and were present for Will's job in the FBI, thus making his return to the light at the end of the film all the more traditional in ending. As mentioned before, the film takes some liberties with where and how to present the story's villain, Francis Dollarhide, and his arc. Tom Noonan decided to study other serial killers for the role, but was disgusted by what he saw and read. He then decided to play the character as a man who felt like he wasn't harming the victims, but helping them. "I wanted to feel this guy was doing the best he could, that he was doing this out of love," Noonan said. Cinematographer Dante Spinotti approached the film with a strong use of color tints. Scenes featuring Will and his wife would use a romantic blue, while scenes involving Dollarhide would use a green hue mixed with elements of purple or magenta. This is most visible during the scene of Francis spying on Reba, as his mind creates the nightmarish vision of Reba cheating on him. In a bit of character acting, Noonan requested that no one playing his victims or pursuers be allowed to see him, and those who did should address him as Francis. This adds a level of humor towards the climactic battle with Francis and Will, as Noonan and Peterson never actually met until Peterson jumped through the kitchen window. According to Noonan, his style worked, as it caused a sense of tension on set and people becoming afraid of him, though he mentions that he was also bodybuilding at the time for the role and thought his size was another factor. Dollarhide is presented in both versions as a damaged individual who suffers from being socially awkward due to his upbringing and his cleft lip. This all changes though when he meets a young blind woman at his job named Reba, and the two start to share a romantic relationship, which starts to suppress his desire to murder until Dollarhide's inner self, as he sees that the incarnation of the red dragon from the painting, the Great Red Dragon, takes over. This is further shown after Francis dies and the pool of blood forms around him, alluding to the red dragon tattoo he wore in the novel, and his metamorphosis into becoming the Great Red Dragon. The major difference between the original work and Manhunter, though, is that Dollarhide's arc is spread through a majority of the novel. Like with Buffalo Bill and The Silence of the Lambs, the reader isn't going through the story to find out who the killer is, but to see what the killer might do next and how they live during these events. In the film, however, Dollarhide's character and arc doesn't come into play until the third act of the film, taking a more traditional mystery route of keeping the audience out of the loop on who the killer is for a majority of the story. Personally, this hurts the overall flow of the film and feels like a disservice to the character who is so brilliantly portrayed by actor Tom Noonan, making his character arc feel rushed. Because of this handling, the aspect of tragedy around Dollarhide as a character is lost, as in the film he's a killer whose urges to murder are being repressed not by his own choice to be with Reba, making his failure all the more tragic, but by circumstance, which is broken due to the character's own mental instability. Similarly, as mentioned in the deconstruction of Will's character between both the novel and film, Dollarhide meets his end at a different point in the story than in the original novel, which makes things feel a little unfinished. This is an aspect the remake from 2002, Red Dragon, gets better than Manhunter, as it spreads Dollarhide's arc throughout the film and thus gives us a greater connection to him as we view his journey more as a tragedy, giving us insight into his past from the novel and the abuse he faced growing up, which formed him into the monster he doesn't want to become. As one can tell with the differences shown, Michael Mann's direction in the adaptation is not to tell a perfectly faithful adaptation of the original novel, but instead to take that novel and put his own spin on it. It's a spin that makes the world both visually sterile and yet at the same time colorful, a clinical approach similar to the way Brett Ratner and others took a more gothic view to the world and story of the Red Dragon novel. This becomes more prevalent when comparing the film's approach to the character of Hannibal Lecter by actor Brian Cox compared to later Lecters like Anthony Hopkins and Mads Mikkelsen. When we first encounter Hannibal in Manhunter, we are in a sterile white room with bars, Lecter on one side, Will on the other. The scene is a simple yet perfect way to bring Lecter's self from the novel to life and a visual narrative to show how Will and Lecter aren't actually that different from each other. Comparatively, in both the film Red Dragon and Silence of the Lambs, Lecter's cell is a see-through wall of steel and supported glass housed in the basement of the asylum he's staying in. Both are stark contrasts to his environment and how he behaves, and each works for their respective adaptation. A little fun fact, actor Ted Levine, who would later go on to play Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, crashed Manhunter's rap party so he could meet up with William Peterson, who he had worked with in the Chicago theater. This ended up getting the actor an audition on the television series Crime Story after meeting with Michael Mann at the party. In recent years, Manhunter has started to gain a cult following, with many newcomers praising the overall visual aesthetic and music choice for the film. This comes as a wave of new films that praise this period of filmmaking with high-key, colorful lighting and a synthwave score are being released, and a new appreciation for these films has been born. Like with most novel-to-film adaptations, it uses what would work thematically and for the time the film was being made than trying to bring every aspect of the novel to life, which usually results in the adaptation becoming bloated. With Hutchins' focus on adaptation theory, Manhunter is a successful adaptation of the original novel. It serves as a work that is a derivation of the original source but doesn't feel derivative, thanks to certain alterations done for the sake of showing a better film. Even with some changes, for better or worse, it's still a good film that has pleased fans of the original work as a piece that accurately represents a majority of the story, characters, and themes. Manhunter is currently available in a collector's edition from Scream Factory, which I highly recommend you watch as it contains numerous interviews and behind-the-scenes features and interesting stories about what went on during the production of Manhunter. Thank you for watching.
Just you and me now, sport.